This is Frank Sawyer with Hollywood Sports, and today's topic is handicapping college basketball using tempo-free statistics. The advantage of using tempo-free stats is this allows us to more accurately forecast how a game will be played relative to the competing styles of the two teams and taking into account the relative strengths and weaknesses of both of those teams. Now, tempo-free statistics takes into account the pace that each team uses, and pace is critical in understanding the basic metrics of college basketball. In theory, you could look at how many points a team scores and think that's how good they are on offense, but that is a limited view of really how efficient they are. Let's use the Florida-UCLA Sweet 16 matchup that happens to occur tonight. Florida averages 70.4 points per game, while UCLA averages 81.5 points per game. So on initial glance, you'd think that, well, UCLA's got a much better offense because they score 11 more points per game. But that doesn't take into account how fast UCLA plays and how slow Florida plays. Let's look at pace and contextualize these numbers. Florida averages 63.1 possessions per game, which is the 321st slowest pace in the nation. In comparison, UCLA averages 69.6 possessions per game, which is the 41st fastest in the nation. So UCLA is averaging 6.5 more scoring opportunities per game, and that is translating into 11 more points per game. But using Ken Pomeroy, he's the college basketball metrics guru, using his adjusted offensive and defensive efficiency formulas. Actually, these two teams are very close overall in terms of overall offensive efficiency. UCLA scores an adjusted 117.4 points per 100 possessions, which is 12th best in the nation, but Florida is right behind them at 116 adjusted points per 100 possessions, which is 18th in the nation. So the overall conclusion as a handicapper would be that maybe UCLA has a slight edge in terms of offensive efficiency, but it's not nearly as disparate as those original 81.5 points per game, 70.4 points per game numbers that not taking into account tempo would suggest. Now, looking deeper in terms of tempo-free stats regarding how to forecast how a game would be played, there are 4 factors that go into account regarding how coaches try to compose, develop a team, and how they score points and stop the other team from scoring. Those 4 factors are shooting, and that is defined by effective field goal percentage, and that metric is taking the normal field goal percentage and then adding another 50% of every 3-point shot that they successfully make. And so effective field goal percentage more accurately involves the importance of 3-point shooting. The second factor is forcing turnovers or not giving up turnovers. The third factor regards offensive rebounding, regarding what percentage of offensive rebounds you get and how many you allow. And then fourth is the percentage that you get to the free throw line and how important free throw shooting is to your overall offensive output. And all these numbers are determined by percentage of shots overall, percentage of possessions. Not shots, possessions, and not just numbers. So like with offensive rebounding, if a team averages 8 offensive rebounds a game, that doesn't really tell us anything because that number needs to be relative to how many possessions that team has on offense. So let's look deeper at these 4 factors and determine what clues we can figure out from them regarding handicapping. Coaches just make conscious decisions regarding the composition of their team to emphasize certain things. Teams that want to emphasize forcing turnovers do so because they want to increase their scoring opportunities. Now, the advantage to doing this is that you increase scoring opportunities that can help minimize a poor shooting afternoon. And so teams that force turnovers, like Louisville or VCU, tend to do better on the road. The disadvantage of trying to force turnovers, however, is that you may more likely foul the other opponent and put them on the free throw line, and those are easier shots, of course. And also trying to force more turnovers, if you're unsuccessful in doing that, that can leave you in odd man rushes that will allow the other team to get more transition points. Let's look at offensive rebounding. Teams that try to emphasize offensive rebounding, the advantage to that is it increases the number of scoring possessions they have, and often those second shot opportunities are inside the arc, and so those are easier shots. And so teams that tend to do well crashing the boards are better bets when they're away from home because they don't have to rely upon shooting well. The disadvantage, though, to teams that try to emphasize offensive rebounding is that may cause them to foul more. And if the opponent they're playing is good in the foul line, that may create a relative disadvantage to that particular team. And also, teams that emphasize offensive rebounding tend to then be vulnerable on transition points because if they don't get that rebound, then the defensive team now has the opportunity to get transition points with odd man rushes, just like with the turnover situation. The third factor, free throw percentage. The advantage of that is those are easy shots. So if you can get to the line, that's a more reliable way of scoring points than it is trying to hit jump shots. However, the disadvantage of that is you're relying on referees, and when on the road or on neutral courts in tournament situations like we have this weekend, the referees are not always as compliant regarding blowing the whistle as they are when they're refereeing a home team in front of a partisan crowd. Then the fourth factor is shooting, and if teams can shoot a bunch of three-pointers, that's a good way to score points, of course, and it's a good way to minimize the effect of opponents who force a bunch of turnovers or crash the boards well. But the problem with relying on shooting is if you have a poor shooting night, then if you don't have other ways to increase the number of possessions you have, you may be in trouble. On defense, it's good to have a strong defense to limit the opponent's shooting for the above reasons, because if they don't have other ways to create scoring opportunities, team may be in trouble. But on the same token, if you're playing good defense but not doing things to try to create turnovers or scoring opportunities for your end, you may then find yourself on the short end of the sticks regarding points. So all these four factors kind of go together. Coaches have the choice of what they want to emphasize. They do that based off of their particular philosophy regarding college basketball, and the better ones do it reacting to the talent that they happen to have on their team. Let's look at a case example of how these factors play out when handicapping. And a really good example of this was the Creighton-Baylor matchup in the round of 32 last Sunday, where Creighton was a 3-point favorite, and they come in as the number 1 3-point shooting team in the nation, the number 3 shooting team inside the arc. They were scoring an adjusted 125.7 points per 100 possession, which is the best metric ever in the modern era when people started looking at tempo-free statistics. And they were shooting 39.1% of their shots were from behind the arc. Now, so if Creighton's on, they are fantastic. And certainly Doug McDermott may have been the best player in the nation. But the vulnerability that I saw in Creighton is if they're living by the three, the old adage, you can die by the three, and Creighton doesn't do much other things to then create scoring opportunities if those long jumpers aren't hitting. They don't force turnovers, so they're not creating scoring opportunities by getting the ball away from the other team. They were 283rd in the nation in terms of crashing the boards and getting offensive rebounding. So if they're not hitting their shots, they're very vulnerable. Now here comes this Baylor team. Now Baylor is not nearly as good as Creighton, the best team in the nation at shooting threes, but they were pretty good. They were what were they in terms of 3-point shooting? I have it somewhere. 30. They shot in the high 30s. I can't see that. Oh, here it is. They're 42nd in the nation by shooting 38% of their three-pointers. So that's really good, but not elite. That gives Creighton an advantage. But Baylor did other things to create scoring opportunities if they are not happening to be able to hit their threes. They're 3rd in the nation by pulling down 41.1% of their offensive rebounds. And so if they're not hitting threes, they can still score again. And they also don't force turnovers, but that also means they're not putting Creighton on the line as much. And so if Creighton happened to have a bad night, or Baylor could have a pretty good night in matching them at the three-point line, I saw Baylor having a relative advantage because of their ability to crash the boards and not do other things to give Creighton scoring opportunities. And of course, that's what ended up happening. Creighton couldn't hit the side of a barn in the first half, while Baylor was pretty hot. But as Creighton continued to miss, Baylor kept putting on the pressure, and that led to a 30-point victory. That's just one example of how handicappers then can use tempo-free statistics and the 4 factors to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the relative teams to then help determine where there's value relative to the point spread. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. This is Frank Sawyer, and best of luck for us.